Welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast. We're looking forward to another wonderful weekend from the evening of July 25 through to Sunday, July 28. Dive into the heart of New Zealand's storytelling in beautiful Marlborough. Don't forget to visit our website at marlboroughbookfest.co.nz and sign up for our newsletter. For now, please enjoy this session from the 2023 Marlborough Book Festival.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session with Mike White and Cristina Sanders. We are excited, Christine, to hear from you. Thank you everyone for coming along. Dog Point's been thrilled to be associated with the Book Fest since its inception, which was 2014. So it should be 10 years, but they missed a year with COVID and whatnot, so it's had 9 years. So, enjoy it like you have every other one. It'll be fantastic. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Marg. And look, thanks to Dog Point, Ivan and Marg, you've been just tremendous supporters of this festival. You helped make it happen, so thanks again for that. Thanks to the organisers of the festival for putting this on, and thanks to you, the audience, for coming along. It's great to see so many people here this afternoon and at all the sessions, so thanks for supporting it. We're going to have some time for questions at the end of the session with Cristina. There's going to be a couple of mics roving around, so if you can please just wait till the mic arrives before you ask the question, because we're recording it for a podcast. And obviously afterwards, an opportunity to buy books. 3 of Cristina's books are out there in the foyer, and have a chat with Cristina. Cristina Sanders grew up in a Wellington bookshop, so it's a little surprise that her life's been entwined with publishing and writing. Her 2 previous books, Displaced in Jerningham, were widely acclaimed, received awards, but it's her 3rd book, Mrs. Jewell and the Wreck of the General Grant, that we're going to be talking about today. And it's thrust her kind of into the top echelon of New Zealand authors because it was shortlisted for this year's Auckland New Zealand Book Awards Fiction Prize, along with 2 other authors who are here this weekend, Michael Bennett for Bed of the Blood and Catherine Chidgey for the Axeman's Carnival. The General Grant, and some of you all know nothing about this, some of you all know a lot about it, but the General Grant remains one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in the world, a story that's got everything: a dark and stormy night, shipwrecks, gold, survival against the odds, eating seal blubber, and an ultimate rescue. And Cristina's interpretation of these events and imagining of them is really vivid and astounding. Cristina lives in Hawke's Bay, but she's just actually come back from 10 days at sea on the Spirit of New Zealand, sailing from Auckland to Whangarei. And she emailed me while she was on board and said she was sailing with 40 teenagers, and she said, "Lots of fun, no wrecks, but it's early yet." Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Cristina to Marlborough and the festival. So tell us about growing up in a bookshop. Sounds pretty cool.
It was really cool. It was a children's bookshop, and I was a child, and my parents couldn't afford babysitters because they were in the book trade, so they threw me out of the back of the bookshop and made me work from a very early age. It was kind of child labour, really. I had to read the books and comment on them and stick little stickers on them, and when I got older I was paid chocolate biscuits to do stock checks, and a bit later even they got me behind the counter and I would talk to people and try to sell books to them, but I wasn't so good at handling the money. I ended up marrying an accountant because really my money skills aren't very good. So they would let me take the money, but it was grand. It was a lovely shop. It was in the Commercial Union Arcade, originally I think Dominion Arcade, in Willis Street in Wellington, just opposite Unity. So when I grew out of the children's books, I just went over the road to Unity and we did these little swapsies. So I didn't really pay for a book for years.
Yeah,
it's great.
Your life's, you spend a lot of your life in writing, publishing, but you came to writing books quite late in life. So just explain how it was so many years before you actually wrote a book.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I did a bit of writing when I was younger. I always read. I might have always read everything. I've always got 3 or 4 books lined up on my bedside table. Even at the bookshop, I had stacks and stacks of books I had to read. So I know what a book should sound like. And every time I wrote one, it didn't sound anything like the ones that I was reading. And I didn't think I was good enough. And I think my parents were actually quite judgmental as well. And they were very sort of this old English culture where everything that came out of England was great. And New Zealanders, there aren't many people writing good books in New Zealand. And I'd sort of write things, and Dad would say, that might be interesting when it's finished. And I was thinking, it's finished, Dad? It's finished? So it kind of, I just really didn't have any confidence to write until it was a couple of years ago that I was working for a website company, and I was writing copy for, I think the job I was working on was someone it was a paint manufacturing company, and I was writing how the paint flowed onto, this is my copywriting job. And a woman walked in and said, "Hi, I'm Mary Ann Scott. I'm an author. I want a website. Can you help me?" And I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And we got to be friends, and she said she'd come back from Mandy Hager's course, and she was at Whitireia. Unfortunately, of course, it's been cancelled now, but it was a year-long postgraduate writing diploma, and she said, "You should do it. Changed my life." So that was about 5 years ago, and I did the course, and it changed my life.
Three books later, here we are.
3 books later, here we are, yeah.
Awesome.
And the book I wrote on the course, the book I wrote to get into the course was Displaced, and the book I wrote on the course was Jerningham. And the person who had to mark it was Mary McCullum, who marked it and said, "Can I publish this?" And I was going, yes. So all that hassle of having to go and find a publisher and get rejected and stuff,
Nice.
not for me, it was good.
Tell us how you first came across or first heard about the story of the General Grant.
Sailors like to tell stories because you're at sea for a long time and it's kind of boring, and they like to talk about shipwrecks, bless them. So I was out at sea off the East Cape, and it was the replica Endeavour. So for Tuia 250, I don't know if you guys know, Tuia 250 was when they were looking at the early navigation from the Waka from Polynesia and from Cook and going around New Zealand in this beautiful replica ship, the Endeavour, that came over from Australia. And I did the Tauranga to Gisborne leg, and I was really seasick. And we're out at sea, and she kind of rolls like a big belly thing into the ship, and it's a bloom. And a fellow sailor, felt a bit sorry for me, a woman called Jo Tor. And she said, "Oh, I'll tell you a story about the shipwreck." And I was going, "Thanks. That'll really cheer me up." But I was hooked, and she told me the story about the wreck of the General Grant. And I was in the middle of writing something else at the time. I was writing a thing about Taranaki or something. But this thing stuck, and I suppose it stuck because I was there on a tall ship, and the waves were going past, and the sails were flapping, and the horizon was going. And it was so evocative when she told me the story. And then when I researched, and I realised this woman, Mrs. Jewell, was a real person, and she'd never really been written about. And I thought, yeah, there's a story there. So I threw Taranaki away. I've never gone back to it. And I started researching the General Grant.
Okay, so set the scene for us, for just to remind people or to tell people for the first time, set the scene of the General Grant and what we're talking about, where we're talking about. 150 years on, we're still talking about it.
We are still talking about it. It was a big ship, a big American ship, and it had gone from Boston to Melbourne and then was picking up miners from the Melbourne goldfields to go back to England. And it was due to go on the Great South Circular route, so it was going down from Melbourne between New Zealand and the Stewart Island and the Snares and the Auckland Islands, and that big loop around past South America and back up to England. And there's a lot of controversy about the gold, and I'm sure we'll get on to talk about that a bit later. But the ship went down for 7 days, past the roaring 40s into the furious 50s, and there was a whiteout. So there was no celestial navigation. And in those days, of course, they travelled entirely by, checking their course by the stars or by the sun, and there was nothing for a few days. And the charts, we don't know what chart they used. They were probably inaccurate charts. And they thought, through their dead reckoning, which really is a bit of guesswork, that they were further on than they were. And they thought they were well clear of all the islands and had a straight sea between them and South America. But at 10:30 at night, when it was dark and it was winter, and they say they saw an island land off Port Bow. And I don't think they saw it. I think that because it was dark and it was misty, I think they must have heard it. And that in itself is quite terrifying if you're at sea and you're used to the sounds. It's like being on an aeroplane when suddenly you hear that sound, you think, oh. So I think they must have heard the waves crashing off the cliffs. And they realised there were islands where they expected nothing. So they yelled all hands on deck and they squared the sails. Still not quite sure where the wind was coming from, but we think they would have caught the big sails, like 3 big square masts. It would have taken a good 20 people, 20 men, probably more, to square them and go with the wind. And then half an hour later, when they thought they were clear, they had land on the starboard bow. So you've got land on port, land on starboard, and a place where you don't really know where you are, and huge cliffs and this big noise of the wind and the crash of the surf. And then they got becalmed because they were in the lee, we think, of Disappointment Island, and the wind dropped. And of course, this is a sailing ship, and there's no movement without wind. You've got no engine. So there's no steering, and they were caught on a drift, a current that runs up between the two islands. And, they smashed head on into the rocks, and all their bowsprit was torn away. And then they fell down to the side of a wave, and they smashed at the back. And they have a big spanker boom out of the back of the ship for another sail, and that was forced forward into the guy who was on the helm, and he was speared through the heart and was bloody all over the deck. How gory do you want to be?
It's probably
okay.
We're probably about the limit, yeah.
And then the boat gets sort of pushed back and forward in this cove, and eventually this big cave appears in the cliff, and they get sucked into the cave, and they're stuck there because the mast is stuck on the ceiling of the cave, and it gets caught, and the rocks start falling down on the cave, and as the light comes in, the tide comes in, and the wave and the sea picks up, and the mast starts to creak, and they know it's going to breach the hull because the water's rising, and the boat splits, and they two little boats get away, and a third one is toppled in the cave, and they see all these miners with gold stitched into their pockets and their boots and their hats. You don't want to jump into the sea when your pockets are full of stones, especially gold.
Do you want to read a passage now, that first passage now,
yeah,
which kind of sets the scene of what was happening as the ship was being smashed in this cave or cove, and as panic spread throughout the passengers?
Okay. Below was a riot. Decency had disappeared into a shoving brawl. Bags were upended, possessions strewn as people grabbed and stuffed valuables into purses and pockets. The Italian man was there, struggling into an oversized coat, a heavy thing with bulging pockets. His fingers unable to bend for his golden rings. "What are you doing?" I cried, but he elbowed me aside and rummaged in his boots, little sacks moving into his pockets, a bulky hat on his head. "Your baby, sir, your baby." He reluctantly took the burden from me and wedged the child precariously on a sloping table. In the corner sat Mrs. Brown, keening as the doctor put a stitch into her cheek with a coarse black thread. I stood apart from them all, listening to the calls from above, trying to summon courage, not knowing what to do. The ship groaned and creaked, and I went above. And there's a little bit there when they're all going above and gathering their bundles and things above. "Woman forward," called the captain. And from behind him, Joseph shouted my name. It sounded like a betrayal. I couldn't do it. There was a contraption rigged up, a rope and a spar over the side, with the look of the hangman's scaffold. I was pushed to the front of the crowd and peered at the quarter boat down in the water, banging dangerously against the ship's side. The height was too much, and the sea was too dark. I cringed, but there were hands on my shoulders, urging me forward. They wrapped me in a rope and led me to the edge. It happened so quickly, I had no chance to step away, no chance to step back and say, "Not me, someone else must go first." "I can't," I cried. But it was Joseph there then, fastening the knot around my waist, holding me steadily, lifting my foot to stand on the rail, pushing me up onto the scaffold. "You can, my love," he said. "You must. The others will follow you. We need a leader. Be brave." The boat was below. The swelling sea lifted it toward me, and I saw Mr. McClelland and Mr. Brown holding the oars. Tier stood with his arms outstretched for me, and on Joseph's nudge, I cried, "God save me," and I jumped.
So just, to provide a little bit of context, there's 83 people on board, 61 passengers, 22 crew. A lot of them are miners coming home after finding fortune or misery in the goldfields of Victoria. And Mary Jewell and her husband Joseph are two of the people on board. Now, Mary jumps. The next thing that happens is Mary jumps. She falls into the sea. And Joseph, who was her husband, who was meant to be helping all the other people off, jumps in after her. Now, some people called him a coward or selfish. Some thought he was a gallant hero. What do you reckon?
I think he was a man following his instincts. And his instincts were this woman he's just married, they'd only been married a few months, has just fallen into the briny, and she will drown if he doesn't go and save her. And so he jumps. And he was a sailor, his father was a sea captain, he was a sailor, and he was employed as a sailor on the ship. But he'd been a miner for a while, he wasn't a full-time sailor. And I think he thought his responsibility lay with his wife, and that the others would have to fight. But maybe they thought by then that was just a helpless case anyway. I don't know. But I think that's just his instinct. He saw his wife fall and he jumped.
Yeah. Of the 83 people on board, how many survived the sinking of the General Grant in that cave?
15.
So 15 got away. What was the gender split of that, Christine?
There was 1 woman and 14 men.
And the one woman was Mrs. Jewell.
Yep.
So why did you decide to write the book from the perspective in the voice of Mary Jewell?
There are a lot of stories about shipwrecks, a lot of stories about trials of the sea and tribulations at the sea. Most of them are very male-based. So every shipwreck story you get, it's a bloke who's the hero. Sometimes there are women there, and they're always feeble or being looked after and come to catastrophic ends. But there were a lot of shipwrecks with women in them in those days. I mean, this is the 1800s. It's that great, huge transport of people around the world, the families with the women and children moving around the world. So, and shipwrecks were horribly common, and women were ill-equipped to be shipwrecked. I mean, they've got those big ballooning dresses and little hats and bonnets and things, and they don't really have that physical ability to save themselves. And yet here is a woman who did, and her story has lasted to this day, but it's not really well known. And I just love that story of a woman who was a housemaid. She worked as a maid in a hotel, and there she was on this place with these rough and ready sailors, and she survived. And I think it's extraordinary. I think it's one of the great women's survival stories, certainly one of the sea survival stories that we have, and she's kind of lost. I knew nothing. I'd never heard of her. I knew nothing about her. People talked about the General Grant, they talk about the gold, but they don't mention Mrs. Jewell. And I just wanted her to be acknowledged and remembered and, classed as a hero, I think, where she belongs.
So after 2 days, the survivors, who are in 2 little boats, make it to shore. And the first thing that they've got to do, this is middle of winter down in the Auckland Islands. It's not warm. And the first thing they've got to do is make a fire. Can you tell us a story about that?
That I don't know how much of this is true, right? There's all sorts of legends about the General Grant, and trying to work out what's actually true and what's been fictionalized before I even get hold of the stuff is hard to know. But the story goes that James Tier had a packet. James Tier is the hero of the story. He's this big Irishman, and he sort of leads the miners. And they were trying to build a fire. They knew if they didn't get a fire, they would die. They would die that night if they didn't get warm, because they'd been in this freezing water and they had wet clothes. So he finds a packet of wax matches, the ones you can sort of strike on the side of a rock or something. So here's these wax matches. And the story is that as they're trying to build the fire, Mr. Brown, who is the first mate, he's the only officer they have, he's starting to strike the matches. And they turn around and they find he struck match and let it go, match, and it's not catching, match. And the wood's wet, everything's wet. And Tier grabs the match, of all the matches all gone, there's one left. And Tier, being Tier, punches Mr. Brown to the ground, his officer, punches him to the ground. And apparently he's a very tall, 6'4", handsome Irishman. He gets that last match and he puts it in his hair so no one else can reach it. And that makes people go out and grab more firewood until the fire's dry. And then I can just imagine these 15 people around this little pile of wood, which is still a bit damp, and one match. And now, if that's true, I'd love to believe it's true. I want to believe it's true.
Believe it's true.
Yeah. I mean, there's no talk ever after of a flint, so they got a fire lit somewhere. So I love to think it was the last match. And if that hadn't struck, we wouldn't be sitting here today telling the story. They would be dead. So he strikes it, and the survivors talk about the way the match sort of flickers along a piece of grass and then catches between 2 bits of wood, and they're all holding their breaths, and this fire comes alight, and that's this other sort of the living. It's a living thing, and that's the 16th member, if you like. This fire that they keep alive for 18 months. They never let it go out. It's extraordinary, I think.
So they've got fire, but then what do they eat?
Again, we don't really know. Can I talk about cannibalism here? Are we allowed to talk about cannibalism?
Oh, I didn't see that one coming.
We don't know what happened. And my take is that if they had turned to cannibalism, we wouldn't know. I'm just throwing it out. There's no cannibalism in my story. I don't want to trigger anybody. But we don't really know what happened. They might have been thinking about cannibalism. There's some rumour that somebody says later on about chasing someone because he's worried he's going to be eaten. So we know at times they were very hungry. But what did they eat? To start with, they just got limpets. Just really went down to the shore, the water edge, and picked up crabs and threw them on the fire and sucked them out. There was some very small mussels there. I think they had mussels and paua and limpets. They had meals for days that were just limpets. I don't think I've ever eaten a limpet. Have you eaten a limpet?
No, I'm not going to either.
Well, you might if you shipwrecked on the Auckland Islands. So it was pretty. And they had some tins. So when they left, there was no such thing as lifeboats. So when they fell off the ship, there was not a lifeboat that was equipped. But Sanguili, who was a young Cuban sailor, threw some cans onto the boat and a little bit of pork onto one of the little rowboats. But it tipped over. They lost a lot of it. They had 9 cans of food. And they wanted to keep those to when they were absolutely starving. But they did open one of those on that first day. And I can imagine, so 15 people sitting around, I think the cans were yay big, and having a spoonful each and watching who's you've had too much. Stop. And watching who's eating it, But they kept the rest of the cans, and then they started to think bigger and go out and start hunting seals.
Yeah, seal blubber.
Seal blubber.
Yum.
Yeah.
And
you obviously haven't eaten that either, or you wouldn't be saying yum.
Yeah, it was ironic. And eventually they found some pigs, didn't they? Tell us about the pigs.
That was quite a long time later.
Yep.
And they had stories. I mean, there'd been 2 shipwrecks there a couple of years before. One of them, Musgrave, who had been there for, they were 12 months or something on the island on the south side, and the Invercord had gone on the north. And because of these shipwrecks, the Acclimatation Society knew that there were people being shipwrecked on these islands. It was just right in the middle of the trading route. So they went down and they put up little depots. And they put finger posts, apparently, around the island saying depot this way, but our guys never found them. But they had this inkling that these things were there, that they had been left behind by Musgrave's lot. So they were fantasizing about the fact there were pigs on the island. But they were all down south. They didn't find them for a long time. And it was about over 12 months later, they were going for a row down North Inlet, which was on the other island that they were on at that time, and they found traces of pigs, but they couldn't catch them. And then the ever-inventive James Tier managed to make a hook out of... He found some old steel that had been left there before, or some old iron from a previous settlement, and he managed to fashion a hook, and he went out and managed to hook a pig. So he caught the first pig and brought that home, and they made a pet of it. They put a ring through its nose, and can't remember what they called it. They gave it a name, and then they caught a few more pigs. So they did finally get some pigs there. But the first one,
and they fed the pig. Tell the story about feeding.
Yeah, so they got this pig, and they thought, "Yay! We've been eating seal blubber for 12 months. It's disgusting. We've caught a pig. We're going to have roast pork." And they had one of them. Apparently, Patrick Corhey, another Irishman, was quite a good cook. He said, "I'll deal with this pig. I'll make you a beautiful pig." And so he cooked this pig, but they'd been keeping it alive for winter, to when they wouldn't have so much food. So they had this pig, they'd had it for a few months, and they'd been feeding it seal blubber. So they went to eat it. Tasted like seal. So they were, oh, yay, roast pork, thank God, roast pork, the dream of applesauce and gravy, and just tastes like another piece of seal, but even tougher to choose. So pretty disappointing, I should think.
And tell us about this shelter. What do they do to build some kind of shelter?
Yeah, the first couple of days they just turned the boats upside down and lay underneath them. They were freezing, they were cold, the water was running. It rains all the time. If it's not raining, it's sleeting and snowing. And there had been settlements there before. Where they ended up, there'd been a place called Enderby 10 odd years before, where some Māori from the Chatham Islands had come down and some Europeans had tried to build a base there. And it lasted a couple of years and then had just disappeared. They hadn't managed to farm there at all, so they'd gone. But there were some rough huts still left there in the settlement. I mean, they'd been... You know what a hut gets like if it's left for a couple of years. It just so there was kind of a platform and a brief frame, a little frame of a hut. So they used those as the base, and then they just put There was a rata forest there, quite a big rata forest, so there was wood there. And they just made it up as they went along. They sort of lashed, as you would if you were stuck. If anyone's been stuck in the bush, you know what you do. You find bits and pieces and put them together and try to thatch them. And so they made first one rough hut, and then they added another one to it. And then they, later on, they moved to another island and built something more substantial. But that first winter, they just lived in this, it was quite spongy on the ground there. There's a lot of peat. So it was quite a spongy floor, but it was damp. Everything was damp the whole time. And when they finally got the seal skins out, they managed to lie on seal skins to take them off the floor. But that was still a long time because it's very hard to cure a seal skin. You can't just strip a seal and think there's a skin, because it goes hard and it cracks and it gets mouldy and it's revolting. So they had to learn how to cure the seal skins before they could even use them as blankets or cloaks. So it was they had a long live-in period before they actually got any sort of civilization going there at all.
And gradually their ingenuity grew, didn't it? I mean, they made hooks to fish with, they made needles from albatross bones to stitch with. Tell us about what Mary Jewell was, an excellent seamstress with seal skins, and what she made with them.
Yeah, we think she was. It's one of the... Again, we've got a problem with this... original data we don't actually know, because we don't know anything from her own voice. But a lot of women at that age were good seamstresses, and it struck me that if the men were out foraging and doing things, she wouldn't be out finding the seals, she would be doing the stitching. In the stories that we're told, it's James Tier that does everything. No one else does anything. Apparently James Tier does everything single-handedly because he's telling the story. But I imagine Mrs. Jewell was there. And they did make some extraordinary garments. They made... all the men had trousers and jackets, which seems strange now. You think you'd probably try to knit something out of flax, I don't know, but they all made proper jackets. And for Mrs. Jewell, actually she made a skirt. So it's a proper like long skirt with flounces and things. I thought, give us some trousers, but it didn't cross their mind that a woman, even in those circumstances, would be given trousers. And she had a jacket, and they made hats, and they made boots, they made moccasins. Some of them had nothing. They arrived bare-chested, and it was a while before they actually got covered up at all. They were using leaves and stuff to cover themselves to start with. It was pretty brutal. But eventually, they managed to find a way to cure the seal skins and to clean them and to scrape the insides fine enough that they could work them. And that was a long process. They eventually found a tripot. I think that was a big, not tripod, but like a big oven, a Dutch oven they found from Musgrave's hut. And as soon as they brought that back, that sort of changed their lives. They could make salt. They made lye from ground shells, which they put in a very hot fire, and from that they could boil it up and put the seal skin in that. It's a process, and they didn't know how to do it. You think 15 of these men, who were rough men, you think sailors and miners would have some of these skills, but nobody knew how to cure a skin, so they had to work that out, and then strip them and twist them and hang them out to dry and do that process twice in the freezing cold, and then eventually cut the garments and make garments.
I mean, conditions were miserable despite their ingenuity. Your description of it, your imagining of it is miserable. Do you actually think it was that bad, or was possibly worse?
I think it was probably worse.
Yeah.
My publisher did say, this is far too miserable. Can you give us something light, to cheer it up a bit? And I was thinking, yeah, okay. I didn't have much to work with to put in a cheerful note, but it was, I imagine it was. I mean, I tried to make it as authentic as possible. I do a lot of things outside. I like being in the outdoors. I've sailed a lot. I tried to imagine it to be as close to it would have been. And I think the big thing is a lot of them were racked with all sorts of mental problems as well, which would have made the situation more difficult. But that's your physicality of it, I imagine, would have been horrendous. You must have been camping sometime where somebody forgot to bring the matches, and you're sitting there in your Gore-Tex jacket and your lovely woolen things. Oh, we're cold. But, if you go out and bare feet on the grass on a frosty morning, you know what cold feels like.
Given that, is it amazing that so many of them survived? So 4 people tried to sail to New Zealand to get rescue and were never heard of again. 1 person died, but 10 were rescued. But is that amazing, given those conditions?
It is extraordinary. It is absolutely extraordinary. I think it's an amazing survival tale. But the little caveat there is we don't actually know that that's true. This is what they said, and maybe we don't have any reason to doubt them, but there could have been 20 who were rescued and 10 of them died in horrible conditions and they ate them and they just didn't tell us. We're not going to go there. We're not doing cannibalism. But these things could have, we don't really know. The story is, the legend is that we have to work with is that, 10 of them, 15 got off the ship and 10 of them survived, which is just unbelievable, I think.
So the ship sinks in May 1866, and on the 19th of November 1867, a ship is sighted. They light the fires, the signal fires, but the ship sails away.
Yeah.
Tell us what happens 2 days later.
There's another ship. Yeah. But earlier, I think the early one is there's another ship that comes first. So they see their first ship that goes past and think, this is it, we're going to be rescued. And they go rushing out and they light all these fires. They've got beacons ready for these fires. And the ship just goes past. And they think they get in their boat, they row out, they have the sail up. And it's a clear day. For once, there's no mist. And this ship is going toward New Zealand. It's going the opposite way. It's going up toward New Zealand. And so they've got the sail up. And if you've been at sea all that time, there's nothing between there and South America. So they would have seen no land for weeks. And then there's these islands, and they're going past the islands. You'd think, hello, there's some smoke there. And there's a little ship. But the ship goes on. It doesn't stop. It doesn't turn around. And Tia says afterwards, I hope that ship breaks her back. And a couple of days later, when it goes into Invercargill, the ship breaks her back. It gets smashed on the rocks, which I think is quite a nice coincidence.
But they didn't have to wait long for another ship to
That's
come
right,
past.
yeah. So they saw this other ship come past, and they thought, and it goes right past them and around, and they're desperately trying to wave it down, and they're so despondent. And the next day, another ship comes in.
They're not taken straight back to New Zealand,
No,
though, are
no.
they?
The poor buggers, no, they're not there. So they're just done 18 months, and they're all sort of, about to die of scurvy and gone at typhus and whatever. And then they're rescued, and they get on a whaling ship and think, we're here, we're saved. Here is a whaling ship, we are saved. But the whaling ship says, we're going to empty holds. We need to fill up our holds before we can go home. So they're about another 6 weeks on the ship, going around the Auckland Islands trying to fill up the hold with seals because they haven't managed to catch any whales. So they're still stuck there for weeks afterwards.
And when they get back to Bluff, they give them safe passage back to Australia, back to the very place that they started nearly 2 years ago. But then what happens? Because the ship was considered an American ship, and therefore the Australian authorities decided that they weren't responsible for giving them anything. So they were left penniless, essentially, in Australia back when they'd started.
Well, they came into Invercargill first, and apparently the people in Invercargill, bless them, were incredibly hospitable. And they took Mrs. Jewell and gave her clean clothes and took her, and they gave the men accommodation. And they gave them some funds. So then people from Invercargill saved up and gave these sailors some funds, and they got them back to Melbourne. But when they got back to Melbourne, the government did nothing for them. So they were, and apparently they were quite traumatised. It said that it took them a while to find work because they were not really capable of going back to work. They were obviously very severely traumatised, but they didn't know, probably, PTSD didn't exist. They didn't know what it was.
And tell us what happened to Mary Jewell and her husband Joseph.
When they got back, Mary Jewell desperately wanted a family, and she couldn't. She was barren after her experiences on the island. So, I tell you about the baby farm? No. Okay. So they decide they want to have a baby, and so they go to the baby farm in Australia, because Australia had these things called baby farms. And you think that means you go and pick up a baby, but no, you go and pick up a woman, and you say, yeah, that one. And Joseph goes off with the woman, and she carries the baby. So it's a different kind of baby farm. So anyway, Mary Jewell's sitting around at home while Joseph is out trying to impregnate this woman with their child. And on the child's birth certificate, Jane Minchinson is called her mother, and Joseph her father. And then on her marriage certificate, Mary Jewell is called her guardian, I think. So she obviously formally adopts her. But by then Joseph dies not long after, I think. But Mrs. Jewell marries again.
Before that,
yes,
Joseph and Mary went round giving talks dressed up in their sealskin outfits from the Auckland Islands. Yeah.
I think Mary did. I don't know that Joseph did. Okay. So it's kind of sad that this hasn't been kept. So she went round, her ancestors, her descendants I've talked to, say that there's all these rumours that Mary went round and gave talks to halls full of people, and she earned, I think they say £300 or something in a circuit, which was a lot of money in those days, going around in her sealskin suit. which kind of makes me feel that she wasn't badly traumatized on the island. I mean, she was traumatized, but she wasn't attacked or anything, because you wouldn't, if you were attacked on that, you wouldn't go up and start talking about your experiences on the island. So she talked about it quite proudly, about what she'd achieved. But that was at local halls and things, but if there are newspapers reports or anybody writing in letters and diaries, they've been lost. So I would love to hear Mrs. Jewell's voice about what happened. But we just don't have that. Maybe it's still there somewhere, but all the descendants have looked through every trove in Australia and all the different museums and things. They've never come up with anything, unfortunately.
Let's talk about gold.
Let's talk about gold.
Because gold is what the General Grant's now perhaps best known for. And it's sort of the extra character in this whole story. So the General Grant's coming back from the mines of Australia laden with gold, but each of the miners on board has their own stashes of gold. There's stacks of gold on board, hence there was a lot of enthusiasm to get back and salvage it, to find it. 3 of the people that were survived this hideous 18 months turned round and went back to the islands to try and find the gold. Tell us about them.
Yeah, again, we have a slight conflict with what's true and what's not true. I might bring Bill Day into this now. We have a mutual friend, Bill Day, who's the explorer. And Bill has spent 30 years and 5 trips and huge amounts of money going back to the islands to try to find the General Grant. So a lot of what we know about these sort of searching afterwards comes from Bill. But I've done a lot of research with him into why these men went back. So these 3 sailors went back, which makes me think that the gold is somewhere accessible. They went back in 87 and 80, it must have been 88, 89, they went back. So it was James Tier, the big Irishman, Cornelius Drew, who was a sailor, and Ashworth, who was a passenger but had a bit of money behind him. So those 3 went back. 3 separate trips, they didn't go together, which is quite interesting. And they all did it in a slightly different way. So Tier went in from the south and went walking over the south and tried to look down from the top of the hills. They tried to go around in a boat. By that time, they had it had a sort of single screw engine on a tugboat. But the waves there are ferocious. You know, there's about 2 calm days a year in the Auckland Islands, and the waves just smash against those cliffs. And Bill Day describes this very evocatively, how hard it is even now to be able to go dive in there, to be able to go and actually search on those cliffs. So for them to go back, for these guys to go back in the end of the 1860s, early 1870s, to go back and to think they can pluck the gold from that cave seems interesting. You know, if Bill Day can't do it now with all his magnetometers and all his fancy equipment and stuff, these guys think that they could go back and get that gold just with a little tugboat. Kind of makes me think maybe the gold's not actually where they said it is.
This is the thing. The gold has never been found, despite, as Christine says, many attempts, not just from the survivors, but over the years, Kelly Tarleton and Bill Day's trips, it's never been found. Do you think it'll ever be found?
Yes.
And we're all dealing with the same kind. Well, actually, first, do you want to read us that passage about memory? Because this is part of the problem about trying to find out where the gold is, that people are working with limited source material, and you can interpret it differently, can't you? And even the survivors probably remembered things differently. So
I think they probably did. Okay. This is set around the fireplace, because a lot of action in this book happens around the fireplace, where they'll gather and talk. 18 months, a lot of talking. And Mr. Brown and his team have just come back from a foray. The news that Mr. Brown and his men had navigated the west coast on calm waters went around the men like fire. The weather was right, the opportunity was there, so we took it. Mr. Brown, in a rare rational moment, gave the briefest report. We've confirmed where the General Grant sank. There was nothing to salvage. Confronted with further hostile questioning, he glared the men down, and it was clear he felt no obligation to report to anyone. He said nothing about going back to find the ghost of his wife. Tier wanted more. He was dismissive of the men's claims. You say there are hundreds of caves in the cliffs, Mr. Brown. I suggest we wreck considerably north of where you're telling us. You saw no evidence it was our cave. We found our cave. We didn't leave the ship that morning and row 6 miles past the island, said Tier. And that first night we spent the rocks in the channel. You're forgetting. I'd forgotten the rocks. There had been rocks. Couldn't remember the island. There'd been no sun. We might have been rowing in circles. Ashworth agreed with Mr. Brown. We rowed through the day and didn't reach the island until evening. We were well south. We were pulling against the current, barely mooning those first hours. This was Kohi, but Ashworth shouted him down, said he had the memory of a girl. This cave, said Mr. McClellan, a fence has grown bigger in our heads. It was a scoop in the rock, I remember, more an overhang and a crevice. You remember incorrectly, McClelland, said Mr. Brown. Well, you remembered seeing stars from the cave, said Sanguili, but he hung his head as his officer glared at him. Why didn't you share this information immediately, said Nicholas Allen. Perhaps there was something to see. Spilled bullion. I suppose you saw coins lying on rocks close to the surface. You calling me a liar, Allen, said Mr. Brown. Because if you are, I'll show you an honest punch in your face. There'll be truth enough in that. There was nothing to see in the cave, said Ferguson, a man who seemed unlikely to have the imagination to make up a story. There's no light, and the water is too deep. You measured it, Jewell. You'll confirm that. 25 fathoms, said Jewell. Port side stern. Starboard, said Sanguili. You measured on the starboard side. No, said Joseph, it was the port side. McClelland, who'd measured the depth of the Joseph, coughed but said nothing. If someone had asked me, I wouldn't have remembered which way the ship lay. No one asked me. I remembered the baby and the shawl, the baby that had tumbled from the deck, following its sinking father.
So even amongst them, there was disagreement about what happened on that night, and we've got limited written recollections from them. Do you think, because this is one of the claims that some people make, is that in 18 months sitting around the fire talking, they concocted a story that they would then tell if they were rescued, and they stuck to that story, and that they haven't told the truth about where the gold was?
I think that is quite likely. How deliberate it was, I don't know. I mean, I think if you're with a group of people, you had this horrendous experience, and you have 18 months sitting around a fire every night and with nothing else to talk about, your story would become your mate's story, and his story would become yours, and what you see in your head is something someone else pointed out that you hadn't seen at the time. It happens all the time. Whether they did it deliberately because they intended to go back for it, I don't know. And the fact that 3 of them went back individually and none of them ever got rich. All the survivors, nobody suddenly had a pot of gold appearing and they got very rich and they went off and did things. So we know that. We know that the gold was never found by these, or we're pretty sure the gold was never found by these guys. But whether that was a deliberate thing they cocked up between themselves is that's what they would say, or whether it's just this misremembering that gradually merged into one story. You know how that can happen. You've got groups of people talking about what happened at a party, and you get one story that becomes the story at that event. I think that's probably more likely. But I don't know. The interesting thing is, one of the pieces of data we do have is a letter from Joseph Jewell, Mary Ann's husband, that he wrote to his father. And it feels very genuine. And he talked in great detail about the sinking in the cave in this particular location. And I don't know why he would have lied to his father. It seems if you were making up a story about where the gold is and saying it was somewhere else altogether, you probably wouldn't straight away write this rather heartfelt 10-page letter to your father explaining in great detail. So that's a bit of a mystery.
So the other mystery is, why hasn't the gold been found despite all these people? And what gives you confidence that it will one day be found?
I think I've talked a lot with Bill about this, and there are kind of 3 scenarios. Either the gold has been washed out of the cave, which seems really unlikely. There are lots of other ships along that coast, and they've hit the walls and sunk. And these things are really heavy beasts. The ship itself was wood, but it had it had iron heels. It had this huge anchor. It had all the gear on it. The gold would have sunk. It would have sunk and rested. If it was in the cave, it would still be there. The sea's not going to pull it out. And Bill has gone past with his magnetometer, and he's marked every other ship as he's gone past, and they've all been exactly where he expected them to be. So where they've hit, they've sunk, and he's found another one that was there as well. So it's probably not been drifted out. It could be that there's been a rock fall on it, and there are 1 or 2 places where the rocks have fallen and the cave's there. But even so, perhaps the magnetometer can go through rock, so he'd have to get a bit closer to find out. But he's pretty confident that there's kind of one area that's a bit dodgy, but he's pretty confident he's been all the way along, that he's died in every cave. So I think the only answer is they're all lying bastards. you know. I think that's probably the most likely. And it's very interesting they've kept the secret for so long and they've all gone to their graves without it being shared. But I'm waiting for someone in an audience like this to come up and say, oh, yeah, my name's Tia. I've got a great-great-grandfather and some stuff in his attic you might be interested in, and I'm waiting for that. So come and talk to me afterwards if you've got any information. But
do you think you know where it is? Do you have... and if you do, would you do a deal? But I mean, you've listened to Bill, you've listened to John McChrystal. I don't remember, know if people here remember John McChrystal was here a couple of years ago at the festival. Fabulous sessions. I mean, you've heard all these stories, you've looked at the information. Do you have a different idea to them?
Slightly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've got pirates I'm going to tell before I tell you.
So you actually think that someday someone will discover it, though?
I think that the fact that 3 of them went back with the technology from the 1870s is an indication that they believed they could find it. And I don't believe any technology from the 1870s would be able to go into the cave they described and find it. So it strikes me, if I came off a deserted island where I've been shipwrecked for 18 months in this hell, and I knew where a big trove of treasure lay, I'm not going to go up to the first reporter and say, I'll tell you where it is. I'm going to say, see that really, really difficult cave to find it right the way over there? That's where the gold is. It's over there. You'll never find it. Wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So...
Look, the story of the General Grant is just an incredible one, and you've done an amazing job in filling in so many of the gaps. You describe it as a mix of Treasure Island, Lord of the Flies, Castaway, and the Titanic all rolled into one. You say it's a better adventure story than anyone could make up. That's true?
I think so, yeah. I love the fact that it's man against the elements or woman against the elements. You know, you don't have to invent a serial killer or... I mean, a lot of authors, when you're writing a book, you've got to put things in front of your author, give them challenges, you know, to make the story keep going. So you've got to find a challenge every day to make your character still keep developing. I didn't have to do that. You know, they were all... You know, you couldn't invent challenges that were harder for these guys than God put in front of them, you know, the elements put in front of them. And to make them deal with that was kind of easy. They weren't my challenges; they already had them. So working in that historical context within a frame is, I think, an interesting way to write. I think.
One last question before we get to the audience: if you were on a shipwreck, do you think you would be the brave person ushering everyone in front, or would you be the madly pushing everyone aside, leaping for the lifeboat, clutching your gold?
I would dump the gold, and I would be leaping through the lifeboat for the lifeboat. And I hate to say that, I would step over people, because I've talked to sailors who have been shipwrecked, guys I've sailed with who I trust with my life, and they've said to me after 4 or 5 days when they're running out of water, and somebody throws a rope down to them, they step over their friends. And men that I think are honest and courageous and kind and wonderful people have said that's what they've done. It's just this whole thing about women and children first and brings out the best in people. I don't know how true that is. And I'm a little wussy, really. I don't think I'd be brave and saying, oh, yeah, you'll go first. I think I'd just be fighting my way forward like everybody else would be. I hate to say it, but I think it's true. Don't go sailing with me.
No, I shan't. We've got time for some questions, please. We've got these 2 roving mics here. Just wait till they arrive in front of you so that you can speak into it so that we can record it for the podcast. So just pop your hand up for questions for Cristina. At the back here.
Hi, loved your book. Is it really true it was Joseph, Mary, Jewell? It just sounds like something out of a storybook.
It's lovely, isn't it?
That we all know.
Joseph and Mary. I know, and they're the Jewels, and they come from Clovelly, which is a lovely little town. That's all true. And it's also true the island, the first island I see is called Disappointment Island. You can't make the stuff up. You know, if I was going to make it up, it would be quite so obvious. But yeah, Joseph, Mary, Jewell, I think it's lovely, isn't it?
Just hang on a second, wait for the microphone, thanks.
Did the Jewels ever get back to the UK?
No, they didn't. They never got home.
So they stayed in Australia?
They stayed in Australia. Quite a few of the survivors did. I know that Kohi went home. James Tier ended up in Jackson's Bay in New Zealand. Ashworth went back to Australia. He became quite a successful businessman. The Sanguili, the little Cuban sailor Sanguili, went back to Australia, and his granddaughter read the book and contacted me and said there's now this festival of Cubans every year in Australia, and they celebrate Sanguili as being the first Cuban in Australia, and they still remember him, and she sent me photographs of the family, and so it was quite cool. But no, Joseph and Mary stayed in Melbourne, and they were with Heyman, one of the other sailors. He stayed and lived with them for a long time as well. So they stayed there. I don't imagine they want to get on a ship again.
How long was your research phase, and then how long did it take you to write the book?
I was researching about a 2-year thing from when I first heard the story to where it went to print. And I was kind of researching and writing as I went along, because I thought I knew where I was going with the story, and then I'll do a bit more research and go, whoa, that puts a different slant on it. So there were kind of different parts of the research. Firstly, I just did the empirical research. So I did all the data that I could find and talked to what I could find and tried to understand about where the ship was and read articles from the Times, and then looked at what other people had done where they'd researched, and that was mostly about the gold. But then the second part, which was kind of harder, was looking at the psychology behind it. So what sort of truth they told in the 1800s, what the 1800s attitudes were towards sex and religion and all that sort of stuff, how they would have treated a woman in that group dynamic, and then looking at group dynamics in ships generally. And as Mike said, I do a bit of sailing on the Spirit of New Zealand. And where I was out there last week, we got 40 kids and 13 crew. And you're on this ship, and it's very intense. So that whole idea of how the group dynamics works when things get desperate, with post-traumatic stress and with all this survivor's guilt messed into it, that took quite a long time. So the writing it was quite fast, but the research phase and the sort of sorting out in my head took a bit longer. So about 2 years altogether.
Just following up on that, what source material, first-hand source material, have we got that you were able to look at?
Okay, there's the letter from Joseph Jewell to his family. There's 2 letters to the inquest. They had an inquest. It was reported in the Southland Times, and so that report's from James Tier. But James Tier's report was written on parchment when they were on the boat going back on a sealskin parchment, and Sanguili took it and wrote it out. So that's kind of part Tier, part Sanguili. And then Sanguili wrote his own testimony at the inquest. And then years later, he wrote another report that appeared in Harper's magazine, and it was flourished. It was just beautiful. He had the captain standing in the cross trees, waving his handkerchief as the ship went down. He was a fanciful young man. So I don't know how much we put on Sanguili's testimonies. There's also information from Corhey's nephew. So there's a guy called John Fagan, who was Patrick Corhey's nephew back in Ireland, and he was talking about things his uncle had told him. So that he would have been 17, 18 when his uncle would have told him these stories, and he reported them when he was about 80. So how much of that has been misremembered, you don't really know. So things about the sailor who had an alarming interest in Mrs. Jewell that I've kind of developed in the book, I don't know what that meant. But that was something that came back through Corhey telling his nephew, who tells us years later. So not much actual source data at all. There's some journalists who wrote about it in the Southland Times as well, who wrote about these people coming ashore on their trip to Invercargill and that sort of thing. Very little.
Can't trust what journalists say. Anyway.
Can't trust what journalists say, hell no.
Other questions for Cristina?
I'm intrigued about that you've said that other wrecks have been discovered, but is anything of the General Grant been discovered? Anything to say categorically that is the General Grant, but there may not be gold underneath?
They found Bill Day and his crew found a boat they thought was the General Grant, and they, in a little cave in the cliffs in the Auckland Islands, exactly where they said this one should be. And they went back 10 years later, I think, to pull it up, and they found it wasn't the General Grant. It took them a while to work out that all the things they pulled off, these artefacts, were before 1830. So it probably wasn't the General Grant. Eventually they found a button off a surgeon that identified it as the rifleman. So that wasn't the General Grant. There's been some timber that people said there were sailors that went down, whalers, said they'd seen some timber washed ashore that could have been from the General Grant wreck. We don't really know if that is. It could have been any of the wrecks. The wrecks there from the 2 years before. So the fact they said they saw timber from a wreck washed up on the beach doesn't mean it was a General Grant. So nothing definitive, no. You'd think. Yeah, but it's this hideous coastline. You've got 30 miles running sort of north to south, right across the furious 50s, and the waves come all the way around the world and slap up against that. And John McChrystal describes it beautifully about the booming of the waves that come out of the back of the caves. And he talks about you've got 600 metres of cliff above, huge mountains of cliff, and these peaks there, and the waterfalls come down, huge waterfalls come down, and he says they're blown away before they reach the sea. And I've seen pictures of this, big albatrosses soaring and stuff. It's really inhospitable, even for modern boats, like Bill's on the Sea Surveyor went down, and just even for people like that, he had about 1 or 2 days in a week, he could less than that he'd go out and look. So really not great. A really, really small window, and hugely expensive to go down there. So nothing yet.
You've never been down there?
No, I haven't. I want to go. I keep telling people on the Spirit, let's do a trip to, something. They say, well, I don't know where we get the trainees from for that, but they won't take me. So, no, not yet.
Gentleman over there is wanting to ask a question.
I don't actually have a question, but I have a comment. And my comment is it's amazing to me that these people could last for 18 months. Now, Disappointment Island, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I believe is a long, narrow island, and it's so called because people crashing into it are not safe because they're not on the mainland. The mainland is over further past another very treacherous strip of water, which in order to get to those... I'm speaking from experience. I've sailed in this area.
Okay.
And I've seen the fingerboards. They're still there. They had to get from Disappointment Island to the mainland to get to the supplies. And if they didn't have a boat, they had to wait till they had some seals to make the coracles or whatever.
They did make
across.
The coracles, yeah.
So my amazement is that these people could exist for so long, and when the rata that you talked about would be no higher than this, fully grown, but bent because of the wind, almost parallel to the ground. It's just so inhospitable that we can't imagine. And being winter, that screaming cold westerly wind, continuously. We can't moan about the southerly here, really. Thank you.
Thank you. I love the way you express that you've obviously experienced it, because that look in your eyes as you talked about the wind. Yeah. I imagine it is. I mean, I've talked to a lot of sailors who have been there, and they said it's the most inhospitable place. Yeah, terrible. Dramatic, sort of Wuthering Heights-ish. Dramatic.
Without the romance. Time for one last question. Anyone got a question? Over here.
If some intrepid explorer finds some gold, who has the right of ownership?
That's a good question. It's not really clear in New Zealand. We've got the Taonga Act, which means that's part of the Heritage Act, I think, which might overrule. That's a bit sketchy. Generally speaking, if there's gold aboard, it belongs to the government, or if it's government gold aboard, it belongs to the government. And this was, if they were taking all the extra gold they think was on there, was New South Wales gold, which was going to the Bank of England. So if that's true, if that gold was aboard, that would belong to the Australian government, unless the gold was insured and the insurance company had paid out, and the people who had paid out to were still... It's quite a complicated thing. We're pretty sure there's no connections now left for people who could claim, but it's hard to know whether the government, being as it was New Zealand, it's a New Zealand island now, but it was Australian gold and it was an American ship. Complex. So put your name down on the list and you know.
Wait on. Thanks.
Are you going to write a sequel if they find the gold?
Oh, hell yeah. Yeah, I'm going to write the movie. I'm going down. Yeah. I'm going down there.
Go big.
Look, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. Fabulous session, fabulous to hear the story. It is an incredible story, and Christina's retelling of it is utterly astounding. Thanks for coming to Marlborough, to the festival. Can you just join me in thanking Cristina for today?
Thank you, Mike.
And Cristina will be outside in the foyer signing books like normal, so come and have a chat to her.